The midpoint is one of the most important plot points in your story, and today I'm going to explain to you both what a midpoint is and how to write one effectively. But first, if you're new to my channel, hello and welcome. My name is Claire Fraze, and I am an award-winning author who makes videos on this channel sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I am the author of the paranormal ghost thriller They Stay series, including books They Stay, They Whisper, They Return, They Hunt, and book 5, which will be releasing at some point. I've taken a lot of courses and read a lot of books and studied in a lot of classes to try and improve my writing over my years, and I share all of the tips that I've found most helpful on this channel. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And without further ado, let's jump into this video. First, what is a midpoint? A midpoint is a key point in the narrative of your story that divides your story into two halves. It's a shift in the narrative big enough to differentiate the first half of your story from the second half of your story. Like in the book Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. Spoiler alert if you haven't read it, I will give you the timestamp here to skip to if you don't want this major spoiler. Up until the midpoint of Gone Girl, Amy has gone missing and Nick is searching for her, and Nick is under a lot of scrutiny because people think that he's the one who might have had something to do with her murder or disappearance. It mostly follows the police investigation of Nick as they try to piece together what happened to Amy, and it's open whether or not Nick is telling the truth. He may be an unreliable narrator, and the story of Nick and Amy's relationship is told in flashbacks. But in the midpoint of Gone Girl, the narrative takes an extremely dramatic turn when it's revealed that Amy staged her own disappearance to try and frame Nick for her murder. This casts everything in the first half of this book in a completely different light, and the giant twist makes the second half completely different from the first half, because the audience knows different information that they can use to frame the events with. The midpoint is important for a couple of reasons. One of these reasons is that it's common for stories without midpoints to have a sort of sagging middle. You have the beginning that's really exciting and the ending that's really exciting and just a lot of stuff that has to happen between the beginning and ending, and that makes the middle of the story not feel very exciting. So from a pacing standpoint, having a midpoint that turns the action on its head and surprises your readers can do a lot for keeping them engaged while reading the story. I like to think of my midpoint as the centerpiece of my story and almost as a sort of mini climax. It's not the real climax, but up until this point, it's the most exciting and invigorating scene or moment that's happened so far in the plot. And it changes something significant about what happened before it. The characters have a major revelation that they didn't know before that ultimately will impact whether they're victorious in the climax. The characters have a major failure but discover something new. So what makes a midpoint effective? First is that it has to reverse the action. Successful midpoints flip the direction that the story is going in. For example, if you're writing a mystery novel, your characters might be following a certain lead for the first half of the book, then go to confront that, and then have a major development come in that totally flips the action on its head, shows that that lead actually wasn't the person who committed the crime, and delivers a piece of information that changes the entire case. That would divide the story into the first half of the story, which focused on the first lead, and the second half of the story, which would focus on a completely different framing of the crime. 2, your midpoint has to raise the stakes. The most successful midpoints elevate the stakes for your hero. Now your hero has a lot more to lose if they don't defeat the villain. Maybe in a thriller they discover that the criminal is actually also hunting them instead of just hunting other people. Now they might risk losing their life on top of not defeating the villain. 3, your midpoint should emotionally impact your readers. Your midpoint should evoke a strong emotional response from your readers, whether that is because there's the betrayal of a beloved character, there's a character death, your hero just goes through it and is put through a lot, and that's really upsetting to watch, so long as your reader sympathizes with your hero. In a lot of cases, your midpoint can twist your plot in a way that changes the reader's understanding of the story. Not only does it flip the direction of the narrative, but it gives you another piece of information that completely changes your understanding of the story and how the story is working and what it wants to make you feel. So now I'm going to talk to you about my favorite example of a midpoint in any piece of media I have ever consumed, and that is the midpoint in the movie Knives Out. If you haven't seen Knives Out before, Knives Out is the story of a family, and the grandfather, kind of patriarch of the family, dies suddenly at the beginning of the movie and seems to have been murdered, and the entire family is kind of under scrutiny, and this detective comes in to try and solve the case and investigates the family and the people that work in the house and tries to get to the bottom of who murdered the patriarch. This section will also contain spoilers for Knives Out, so if you have not seen that movie, I will give you the timestamp to skip ahead to. I make a lot of videos analyzing plots, but the midpoints are major reversals, and so in case you haven't seen them, I don't want to give these movies away because they're very good movies. Knives Out tells the story of Harlan Thrombey, who was found the morning after his 85th birthday party with a letter opener in his hand and having seemed to have slit his own throat. The police think that Harlan has been murdered, but then a private investigator shows up who had been anonymously hired to solve the mystery and treat it as a murder investigation. So the first half of this movie follows this private investigator as he collects clues and interviews family members and starts to piece together what might have happened that night. And we also start to get to know the character of Marta, who is Harlan's nurse, and who was with him the night that he died. A lot of the evidence is starting to point towards Marta as having killed Harlan, and she's starting to look like a pretty good suspect in the first part of the movie. But then when the midpoint happens, it's revealed in a flashback what really happened that night between Marta and Harlan. What really happened is that Marta injected Harlan with a lethal dose of morphine after confusing it for a medication that he was supposed to be taking. But then she couldn't find the antidote for the medication, and so she panicked, and instead of allowing her to phone for help, Harlan uses his knowledge, because he's a mystery author, of crime and murders and whodunits, to help her create a false alibi, and ends up slitting his own throat to try to get her off the hook, because her family is undocumented and he doesn't want them to be deported. So because Marta is so likable and everybody has started to really root for her, the second half of the movie stops being a whodunit, because we already know what happened, and starts being a how is she going to get away with it, because nobody wants Marta to go to jail for what happened, but it's starting to point toward, like, all the clues are starting to point towards her, and the detective is really good, so he's piecing together what happened. This midpoint not only completely shifts the action and has an emotional impact and twists the plot and reverses the action, but it also turns and changes the entire genre of the story from the whodunit to a how's she gonna get away with it. The stakes are raised because we really care about Marta and want her to get away with it, so it hits every single one of the 4 elements of a very good midpoint. So how do you come up with a good midpoint? Sometimes your midpoint naturally appears and makes itself clear to you right off the bat. Sometimes it's a little bit trickier. The question I ask myself when trying to come up with a midpoint is, what new discovery, new piece of information, new revelation will help my character take charge of what's happening in the plot and move forward in the story? What thing needs to happen in order for the character to discover what they need instead of just to go after what they want? In a lot of stories, characters have a goal, and that goal is what they want, but the ending of the story gives them what they really need and they didn't know that they need, not what they wanted at the beginning of the story. And so the midpoint can act as the event that clarifies or almost ends the plot of them trying to get what they want and clarifies what they need, and then they spend the second half going after what they need or ending up with what they need, even though they might not be conscious of that. There's no one way to craft a midpoint, because sometimes they'll just appear to you, and in some stories they're easier to come up with than others. But your story midpoint doesn't have to be a plot midpoint. It can be an epic battle if you're writing fantasy, but if you're writing a contemporary character-driven novel, your midpoint is not going to be a giant battle with dragons. It will more likely be a character moment that really clarifies what the character had been working towards up until this point, or what they need to do in order to get to the end goal and get through the climax successfully. So you want to consider the main conflict in your story. You want to think about the emotional journey of your protagonist and their general character arc and figure out how that changes and how they need to change from the beginning of the book to become the person that they need to be in order to come through the climax successfully. And think about the stakes in your story and what the character risks losing if they don't come out of this successfully. And think about a way to clarify that and to raise those in a scene. There is no one way to write a midpoint, so it's important to experiment with different scenes, to brainstorm and think of different ideas, and to play around with what different midpoints could look like in your story if you're not sure about whether your midpoint is correct. So that's it for this video on midpoints. I hope that this video was helpful. If it was, please make sure to like it and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this one. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, my name is Claire Fraze, and I'm an award-winning author who makes videos sharing actionable writing tips that personally helped me improve as a writer. I said Knives Out was my favorite midpoint in any book or movie that I've ever read or watched. Do you have a favorite midpoint? If so, drop it in the comments. I would love to see what your favorite midpoint is and why you like it so much. And take it a step further. Analyze why you think you like that midpoint so much, because that analysis will give you some insights into what an effective midpoint is and how to write one in your own stories. I hope you have a fantastic week, everybody. And as always, happy writing.